Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Baker. We're going to continue learning about evolution. Today, we are going to talk about what makes one species different from a already existing species and what kind of causes this actual differentiation. So what makes it actually different. So this is the dividing line between an existing species and a new one that is arising or forming. Right? So let's remember our definition of species is a group of individuals, it doesn't matter in how many populations they live, that can mate and produce viable offspring. All right, so we're already familiar with that concept. We've talked about it before, but I mean viable offspring as in they can have their own kids, right? They can mate and cross and have offspring that can do the same thing. Some interesting concepts that we might have heard about, at least in pop culture or in our lives before, are hybrids. Hybrids are animals that are from two different species. So it's a cross between two existing species that produces a viable offspring that is not a new species in and of itself. All right. So a wolfen is a cross between a dolphin and a killer whale. It is a rare hybrid that does not normally happen, but there's not enough of them to form their own populations, and there are not enough of them to mate and cross naturally. A growler bear is the same thing. But with a polar bear and a grizzly. And then we have ligers and tigans, which are different combinations of lions and tigers. It depends on if the male and the female are a lion or a tiger and which one is which, how they mix, if it's a liger or a tigan. This picture here is of a tigan. And so these are all just examples of hybrids that are a different species, but there are not enough of them for us to really classify them as a species, scientifically speaking. All right, so these are those outliers. I just wanted to throw them out there, and they look interesting. All right, so speciation is the process of actually differentiating. That means actually separating them apart. A new species from an existing one. So we've got an existing population, something happens to them, and they split into two different species, right? The 5 things we're going to talk about are what we'll call different isolations, right? So isolate means to make separate and to set aside or to make alone. All right, so behavior isolation is going to happen when the two different populations have different mating habits. So they're not going to be able to attract mates from the other population, so they're going to be different species. Ecological isolation, that means that they live in different habitats. They might live in the same location, but in a different habitat, like if you had a forest. Two different frog species might live one deeper in the forest, whereas one might live right on the edge of the forest. So they're the same environment, same geographic location, but a different ecological location. All right, so turning that dial up to 11, we get geographical isolation, which, like I said, it's similar, but there's a physical barrier in the way. So they might live on an island versus the mainland. There might be a mountain range in the way. Right? And then we have mechanical or chemical isolation. You could think of this as having different parts. They physically cannot mate. Something is blocking them. And then we've got temporal isolation, which just means they breed at different times, either different times of day, different times of year. All right. So it could be just different seasons. It could be ones in the morning, ones in the evening. All right. So behavioral isolation. We're looking at either different mating dances or different bird song calls. So this is a reproductive isolation. Reproduction cannot happen because there's no interest. Right? Ecological isolation, like I said, they're going to live in the same environment, but they're going to be in different locations enough that they won't meet. Right? Geographic isolation, we've got this barrier, so we're going to have a part where a founder's effect is first going to happen, where the populations will split, And so in this example here, we've got a pond where the original population splits. Some of them go around the barrier clockwise, some go around counterclockwise or anti-clockwise, and they continue changing as their habitats move and they migrate, right? And by the time they come back together, they are different species. So they've met on the other side of this pond or lake. It's probably a large sea if we need something this big, or the animal just moves really slowly. But by the time they get back together, they are no longer able to reproduce. So geographic isolation. So they may have a common ancestor in the original population, but through gene flow, something has happened where they are no longer able to. You sometimes will see geographic isolation pair with one of the other isolations. So we might have this one happen while behavioral isolation is going on, or mechanical isolation is going on. All right, so if the genitals don't match, or the germline cells aren't able to fertilize the counterpart germline cells, then we're going to have mechanical isolation. I like to think of this as a key not fitting in the lock, or the key fits in the lock, but it doesn't line up the pins so that the lock will turn, right? So sometimes this is also done through something called chemical isolation, where chemicals inside the female's body don't allow procreation with the females from the males, or the chemicals from the male's body. And so we'll get a mechanical isolation done through chemical means. So you might see a chemical isolation example, but it's really just a form of mechanical isolation, right? So temporal isolation is a case of the right place but the wrong time, right? So we might have different species of flowers that are from the same original gene pools, but one of them has started to bloom earlier in the year versus later in the year. And so they may even look alike, but because they have different times of the year where they are blooming, producing pollen, accepting pollen to create the offspring, they won't actually mate with each other. One of the interesting things that's been done in science is we've taken mosquitoes and isolated them in a room and changed their circadian rhythms so that they think it's a different time of day than it actually is, then allow them to interact with a wild type natural mosquito that is on the correct time frame. And because one of them wants to mate earlier in the day versus the other one, which wants to mate in the later part of the day, they won't actually mate. And that was one of the ways that scientists wanted to at first try to lower the mosquito population. Right? So we might have time of day, it might be seasonal, it could be that one is nocturnal and one is diurnal, awake during the night or awake during the daytime. So temporal isolation has to do with time. Right? So something to think about here is also the rate of speciation. So how fast this actually happens. We've got two different models that look like they might be happening at the same time or going back between one and the other as far as macroevolution is concerned. So we've got gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, or equilibria if we're talking about multiple equilibriums. Right, so gradualism is gradual, right? It's a slow and steady change, so smaller increments of change over a period of time where we've got a lot of different variations overall. Punctuated equilibria is the same amount of time, but we're going to have larger jumps between the individual organisms. So we're still going to see the same overall large changes. It's just how fast those happen and how many different variations are actually there between the first and the last of our examples here. Right, so this is this picture is a little bit grainy, I know, but I'm working with what I got. And so we've got a horse and a horse ancestor. So that different models show either a lot of different variants between the progenitor horse and what we know as the modern horse, or we've got rapid changes, so bigger changes happening, and then that variation. That species will exist for a longer period of time, and then another rapid change will happen. A new species will occur, and so these new species will continually build and build until we only have the current modern horse. Right? So you may also see them drawn like this, where we've got these branches kind of happening in different ways. So a gradualism model is on that side. Sorry, my camera's flipped. And so we've got gradualism over here and punctuating equilibrium on this side of the slide. And so the cladograms are going to look a little bit different as well. These same morphological changes, the same changes in the phenotypes are occurring, but they're shown through different models, right? But no matter what, they're coming through the same common ancestors. So we talked about the different isolations that will actually mark the coming up of a new species from an existing species, and we've talked a little bit about what causes the differentiation. Remember, the founder effect and the bottleneck effect are things that are going to also be proponents of this differentiation, but the actual mechanisms are those isolating types, all right? If you have any questions, obviously you can reach out to me. You might be able to leave a comment. I may or may not get back to you. These are for my own classes, so I may not be monitoring them as closely. But as always, keep asking questions and keep learning.